Greetings to all. It's now 2 p.m. Geneva times. We are officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear delegates, welcome to this new Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue, the series of events that we launched 2 years before the adoption in 2022 of a historic resolution at the United Nations Environmental Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. This series of dialogues making links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the governments of Norway and Switzerland, both joining today's panel to respectively open and close the event. The other co-conveners are the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, known as TESS, and the University of Geneva, who is also joining us on the panel. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop the international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution will be resuming its 5th session in a few months. This series of events that has been providing member states and stakeholders a platform to prepare for negotiation is now reconvening. We are thankful to the coalitions and the other partners who regularly engage with the co-conveners of this series to propose dialogues that we hope can support the work of those engaged in this negotiation. Today, we are delighted to be joined by the chair of the committee, His Excellency Ambassador Luis Vallas, and by experts who will be providing an overview of the progress made and the key priorities that we need to have an ambitious and effective treaty text. I will share some housekeeping rules before you are formally welcomed. Let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available as usual on the webpage of this event. The transcript is available in 100 languages as indicated in this slide. In preparation for this event, we have collected questions for the panel that will feed the discussion of this event. And now, to formally open this dialogue, we have the pleasure to be joined by His Excellency Ambassador Tormod Kaplan Andersen, who is the permanent representative of Norway to the United Nations Office and other international organizations here in Geneva, and a co-convener of this series of events. With that, Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Diana, and hello everyone. Good afternoon from Geneva. It's great to be with all of you, and let me thank the Geneva Environment Network and their partners for bringing us together to take stock of where we are. And just to remind everyone about the importance of what we're dealing with, the plastic pollution problem is the most rapidly escalating environmental problem globally. And at this stage, ahead of the second round of the final meeting, the world is watching us. People everywhere is expecting us to conclude an effective treaty by the end of this year. That is an important objective in itself, and it's also a stress test, I would say, to the multilateral system at a time where many doubt its ability to deliver. And plastic, of course, is the textbook example of a pressing problem that can only be resolved through global solutions. So that's the stakes that we're looking at. Norway has, along with our 69 friends in the High Ambition Coalition, called for legally binding measures across the entire life cycle of plastics to end plastic pollution by 2040. And we also participate in the dialogue on plastic pollution in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that we believe can be a positive complement to the UN process. And, just again to remind you of the stakes, without action, leakage of plastics to the environment will reach 30 million tons in 2040, up from 20 million tons in 2020. And the amount of plastics in rivers and oceans could almost double in the same time period to 300 million tons by 2040. So at the INC5, over 100 countries supported the phasing out of the most harmful plastic products and chemicals in a globally coordinated manner. That is not nothing and something we can build on. Over 100 countries also supported the goal to reduce production to sustainable levels and committed to taking measures across the life cycle to this end. On the process, we believe that we can consolidate this large group of countries for an effective treaty also when it comes to financing and means of implementation. Because I think we all agree that the treaty should have a robust financial mechanism to support recipient countries and their activities to combat plastic pollution. So we see it as a crucial objective to reach agreement on the relevant provisions, relevant articles on these issues, that is 3, 6, and 11, ahead of the INC 5.2, to be able to conclude negotiations on an effective treaty there. We cannot leave this to our principals to decide. We need to reach agreement in advance. We hope you also agree that and can support efforts to find common ground ahead of the INC 5.2. We, as Norway, expect to participate at ministerial level, and I encourage you, your countries also to participate on the political level. As we all are getting ready for the resumed session, I would like to thank Diana and her team for all of their efforts to create these important opportunities to share information and look at priorities ahead. We can do this. And I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Luis Vallas Valdivieso from Ecuador, the chair of the INC. Dear colleague, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellency, dear friend, Ambassador Edrensen, for giving me the floor. And thank you, first of all, to the Geneva Environment Network for organizing this very, very important webinar, and for giving me the opportunity also to share with you different my views, my perspective, and also my messages to all of you. Thank you very much for that indeed. First of all, I would like to highlight the commitment of the members of the member states in this process and taking the positive aspects that we got in INC 5. As Ambassador Edrensen mentioned, we have a high level of convergence in the majority of provisions. So I am glad to see how members are talking in this also intersessional period about that. Also taking the chair's text that I present at the end of INC 5.2 as a point or a starting point of our future negotiations. So quite important also a goal that we got in INC 5. And also, I'm glad to see that member states are going deeper in those provisions that are more complex. Ambassador Edrensen also mentioned those articles, and I can see also the light when I see members talking about that. We all can recognize that the key to success is to find common grounds, landing zones, agreements. And I see, once again, I would like to reiterate that I see that this is happening in this intersessional period. And I'm encouraging members to do so. And I'm happy to see that they are doing so, and also that they are reporting on their preparation towards INC 5.2. The process is very much alive, and we saw that in INC 5 and after INC 5.2. And we need to keep it alive and keep working very hard for a successful INC 5.2. I urge member states to work together and prepare INC 5.2 to have a success and in INC 5.2. We have problems. Yes, we have complex issues, but one main problem that we have been facing since the beginning of this process is time. Time constraints and time limitations that we have faced, and we are still facing that problem. That's why we need to be effective, very effective in the organization of our work. This process has different particularities, but one of them is to have, and we have seen, and that's positive, is a positive particularity to have more than 3,000 observers participating, and is increasing that level of participation. And it's very important, their contribution, not only participation, but also contribution. And I want to reiterate that we will keep working together with all stakeholders, scientists, representatives from civil society, private sector, and we will strengthen also the communication with observers during 5.2. Once again, thank you so much to Geneva Environment Network, and congratulations also once again for the 25th anniversary, and I wish 25th, 50 or 100 more years of success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair Vyas. My name is Talash Kantai, and I thank you very much for having me to the Geneva Environment Network. My name is Talash Kantai, as I said, and I lead the team that produces the Earth Negotiations Bulletin at the INC. This panel will deal with unpacking Inc. 5.1 and the way forward. I've been asked to address three things. One, the progress made between Inc. 4 and Inc. 5.1, and also some of the progress made at Inc. 5.1. Two, the points of agreement and contention, and three, the context of the plastic talks within environmental multilateralism. So firstly, on the progress made, as has been said before, like a lot was done. For me at IC 5.1, first and foremost, delegates had before them this new text, the chair's non-paper, which was more focused than the compiled text that they had been expecting to go through. This non-paper contained suggested text in treaty language and suggestions for how to deal with the more difficult issues. That was a giant leap. And in the end, the chair's text out of Busan is 22 pages, which is down from the compiled text, 68 pages. Also, Inc. 5.1 got the text to its most negotiated, and actually, perhaps it can also be called the Red Line Inc., the Red Line meeting, because states shared their red lines on issues throughout the text. They worked in contact groups, which were open, of course, to just a limited number of observers, and also in different configurations of informal discussions, whether they were in the corridors, whether they were more formal. And so in that sense, they're closer to agreement now than ever before on certain elements. States also, as has been mentioned, formed coalitions over important issues, and that's something that we haven't seen before during this process. They were also able to work together on bridging proposals, some of which are now being negotiated, including on issues such as finance, where a proposal from the African group and one from the US have sort of been merged to create what we have now as Article 11. Before I begin to talk about my next point, I have to note that for most of the substantive issues included in the text as it now stands, actions are to be taken at the national level. This is concerning because plastic pollution is a transboundary issue, as we know, and it's an issue of global concern. And limiting action to the national level lowers the ambition quite significantly. At this point, can the text be refocused to prioritize on global actions to end plastic pollution? I hope so, and I think that I'm encouraged by the fact that the chair has talked about intersessional work and ongoing discussions intersessionally. So now onto areas of emerging agreement. Here, I've been a bit reticent. I was very nervous about preparing this because the text obviously has to be looked at as a whole. And there are areas, for example, when you look at the chair's text, most of the text seems clean, but when you have to look at the text as a whole. So, and understand also that this is the chair's understanding of the state of play. Towards the end, actually, in the last plenary, we heard interventions from states noting that the text was not balanced and announcing that they would be submitting more text, which may, of course, balloon the text. But there are core issues that some feel have not been addressed. So as I said, looking at the text holistically, I guess all the substantive issues would need to be ironed out concretely. For example, on product design, extended producer responsibility, on leakages and releases, waste management, existing waste, capacity building, technical assistance, and technology transfer. Also, there are some issues that haven't been included in the text at all at this point, right? So will we see standalone articles on health, on biodiversity? SIDS have repeatedly called for a remediation fund, which is not in the text, which we haven't discussed. So at which point do we get to see that text, and will it end up in the treaty text? And then, as I mentioned before, so global measures versus national measures to end plastic pollution, also very much still on the table and still in contention, because these help to set the level of ambition. And then will these measures be voluntary? Will they be mandatory? All of this is still in contention. And so when you look at the text holistically, you realize that a lot of unlocking needs to happen as we move forward. And then the ambition needs to be raised, even on these sort of simpler issues. So then we can move on to the more contentious issues. As have already been named, the three big ticket items that will require enormous amounts of political will to unlock are Article 3 on products, where the chemicals of concern are sort of said silently, Part 6 on supply and sustainable production, and Article 11 on financial resources and mechanism. The articles on product and supply and sustainable production speak to the very scope of the future instrument, which in itself needs to be defined and included in the text. We all celebrated. I remember I was right there at you when UNEF Resolution 514, which committed states to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, was was adopted, and especially when we saw that this was also to address the entire life cycle of plastic. As we now know, as the information is becoming more and more clear, plastic is the primary material from which plastic products are made. These plastic products, of course, later turn into pollution at one stage or other. So in this sense, states committed to addressing plastic production as well as plastic products found to cause the most harm to human health and the environment, and the chemicals that these plastics contain. So back to the idea of unlocking. How will states balance between their commitment to address the full life cycle of plastics and their duty to the people who make a living in the plastics industry, right? We cannot see an article on just transition without looking at the broader environment in which it is. Finally, the article on finance, which will be discussed later on by other panelists. When the non-paper was first discussed at in 5.1, there was hope that two proposals, one from Africa, one from the US, providing quite different perspectives on how the money component worked. There was hope that those proposals could be bridged. But a lot has changed in the few months since Busan. And the global financial landscape is shifting. Political will around financial flows from the global north to the global south seem to be waning. So how is the new treaty going to ensure adequate finances for implementation? Is a Montreal Protocol-like multilateral fund for plastic pollution, which very many developing countries have been calling for, is that still possible? So again, more unlocking, more discussions need to happen here. But having said all this, let's not forget the broader landscape in which the new treaty will fit in once it's adopted. The issue of plastics or plastic pollution has always been complex. The more we learn about plastic and plastic pollution, the more facets of our lives we know now that it touches. It spans across so many MEAs and other agreements, right? So from the BRS chemicals and waste to climate change, biodiversity, and so many, sort of biodiversity related conventions under that, including UNCLOS. It's also a human health issue. There have been conversations under WHO on this. There have been conversations under the FAO because it affects our food, water security. It's also a trade issue under the WTO with ongoing talks to that end. And I guess, again, states really need to keep in mind that entire landscape as they look towards Inc. 5.2 and as they try to get an agreement. And with that, I hand over to Magnus Lovold, who is a project supervisor at the Norwegian Academy of International Law. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Talash, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So my name is Magnus Lovold. I'm with NAIL, or Norwegian Academy of International Law, as Talash said. I'm very pleased to be with you today. I'm a little bit ill today, I should say. So I hope that my voice will hold and that my head will remain as clear as it needs to be throughout the session. Of course, looking back a little bit at INC 5.1, as we now call it in Busan, I think we all saw the headlines to some extent. The BBC, I think they called it the collapse of the plastics treaty negotiations. I think Reuters reported a failure of the treaty negotiations, and I think there was this general impression of failure in Busan. Created by these headlines, and of course the ambition was to conclude this treaty by the end of 2024. So in that sense, a mere temporal sense, so to speak, it was a failure. But I think it's clear, and I agree very much with the previous speakers, that if you look below the headlines and you look below the surface a little bit, that INC 5.1 in Busan marked actually a significant step forward for this process. Then agree with Talash's point that, you know, there was a sense of considerable more focus in the negotiations than previous INCs. In my view, having followed the INC session so far, the one in Busan was by far the most productive one in terms of outcomes. And I think that I agree very much that the chair's non-papers that were prepared in the run-up to the session, and also went through several iterations during the session in Busan, really helped explore areas of possible convergence, and also highlight the real choices that negotiators are faced with in these negotiations. I also very much agree that, you know, you saw countries and groups of countries showing their cards, their real red lines, submitting some proposals, important proposals on key provisions, including on Articles 3, 5, 6, 11, and 20. And this led to an sort of actual negotiations, and which entailed movement in countries' positions. And I think this, from my perspective, this also indicated an increase in the sort of atmosphere of trust in the process. So I think this is a trust that we to some extent saw also in how negotiators empowered both the chair and the co-chairs to take the step forward, moving on from what I have called a little bit of track changes exercise that we have seen with all the brackets being inserted at previous INCs. But I think from my perspective, most importantly, the meeting in Busan, and why I think it was a real significant move forward, was that it marked what I've called a moment of ascendancy for the progressive majority, which was marked in particular by the two joint statements that were delivered towards the end of the meeting, one by Mexico on behalf of 95 states on products and chemicals phase outs, and also a significant statement delivered by Rwanda on behalf of 85 states. These statements, which I think generated significant energy and support in the room, shows in my mind that the kind of leadership that this treaty process needs, that this leadership is emerging. And sort of looking where we are now, for me, the biggest question is whether this progressive majority will capitalize on or build upon these achievements and develop an updated and near final treaty text ready for adoption at INC 5.2, whenever that may happen. I think the increased focus that were provided by the chair's non-papers and the political will mobilized through the joint statements leads me to hope, if nothing else, that we will see such an initiative emerging in the coming months. And just wanted to also reflect a little bit on what such an initiative will require moving forward, and some of the things that I sort of observing this process will definitely keep an eye out for. And I think there are mainly three main aspects or elements that will require work in my mind. And the first is the technical and legal work to further develop the treaty text in the run-up to INC 5.2. And this is clearly partly an intellectual challenge, figuring out how to design a set of articles that will fit coherently together and actually have the effect that we're looking for. And I think we'll hear more from Joshua and Elena on this in a minute, I believe. But it's also partly a mobilization challenge, sort of bringing the largest group possible behind such a text. The progressive majority, I think, in these negotiations, the states that are involved in good faith, actually trying to find a solution to the problem plastic pollution, is significantly larger than the 100-something states that signed or co-signed these joint statements in Busan. And I think, you know, mobilizing this group and rallying this group will be a significant mobilization challenge in the coming months leading up to 5.2. The second aspect that in my mind will require work I label sort of procedural work, and specifically for this group, this progressive majority, to make a credible path for the adoption of this treaty, even if some countries choose not to join, at least initially. I think I've said, and I've also written before, that the idea of adopting this treaty by consensus, I don't see it as realistic. And I think also some of the spoiler tactics that we saw continue to see on play in Busan made that very clear in my mind, that you need an alternative adoption modality than having basically everybody agree, or at least everybody not disagreeing with the outcome. I do think, I mean, it's very clear that these alternative adoption or adoption modalities as an alternative consensus, they need to be developed, and they exist. There is precedence for adopting treaties by a vote. There's precedence for forwarding draft treaty text to an alternative arena capable of making decisions, or of course simply deciding for countries simply deciding to adopt a treaty irrespective of the forum in which this takes place. So I think we should keep in mind that we have a tendency in these processes to erect our own barriers to some extent. But also remember that no country or a group of country has the right to stop another group of country from exercising their sovereign right to enter into international agreements. So I think it's an important point to proceed upon when thinking about how such a treaty can be adopted. And finally, the last track that I think will require work, and I will definitely look out for in the coming months leading up to INC 5.2, is the political work, to prepare ministers who will ultimately, of course, be the ones signing and agreeing to this treaty on behalf of their countries, and preparing them of what adopting a strong treaty actually requires in terms of leadership. It's clear, of course, that moving on from or moving beyond a fairly deep-rooted culture of what I would call absolute consensus in environmental diplomacy is a tall order and will require significant leadership. And these ministers will also have to be provided with arenas, both at 5.2 but also in the run-up to 5.2, to articulate their support for a strong treaty adopted by a progressive majority of states. That's my 2 cents and what I wanted to say. Looking forward to a discussion, and I now pass the floor on to my dear colleague and friend Joshua Lincoln. Joshua, you have the floor.
Magnus, thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Boston, Massachusetts. It's a pleasure to be with you all. A great discussion, a great start to getting back in the bath of the plastics treaty, as it were. I think many things have already been said. I'm going to try and add a couple of thoughts to the pot in the hopes that we can have a conversation, as it were, to explore further some of these issues. It's been said already. I think INC 5.1, as it's now called, saw a welcome shift to what I would call strategic negotiations as a process. There was more bargaining, there were more proposals, and they were matrixed in the sense that with each proposal there was now a coalition backing it in. This process increased as we went. So that was very welcome. I have to say at the same time that I've heard often the remark that we ran out of time in Busan, and I think I don't really share that view. I think we kind of went as far as we could. There were substantial differences in positions between parties that emerged, and I don't think that they were bridgeable in Busan. In that sense, I want to join the hope and the optimism of Busan to this sort of ongoing concern about whether or not positions can be bridged on some of these issues. And I think in that respect, what is needed, I know we speak about a 5.2, but conceptually, I think we actually are speaking about a 6. We need INC 6. We need a further evolution of the process that we saw. There was an evolution from 4 to 5, and now we need from 5 to 6. Exactly what form that will take, I think, is really the main question for the months to come, for the intersessional period from now until whenever that next session is held. I say that because, of course, there are additional uncertainties that have been added to the circumstances since Busan, in particular the position of the United States. It's too early to tell. It's too early to analyze or project what that position will be, but it will have a substantial impact on the negotiations in this next round. There are sort of three looming questions, corridor questions, three ideas that people were talking about in Busan, before Busan, and since then. And I also think it's useful to identify them, if at least to know what to do with them. And the first is really this idea of a treaty of the willing. It's been spoken about as an alternative. You heard Magnus speak about it. You heard some of the other speakers refer to it. And that is a sort of as an option. I think, again, the perspective on that has changed since Busan, and we need to put it on the shelf for now. It's too early to come to this question in some respects. Similarly, the idea that, as we've heard it again, and I would call that what's been referred to as the Ottawa option, reference, of course, to the Ottawa Landmine Treaty as a sort of step out of the existing process and go next door, across the street, and start a new process. The second one would be the idea that no deal is better than a bad deal. And you heard this very recently articulated in the European Parliament, European Union, and so on. Again, I think perhaps too early to really come to that question. That, in my mind, I always think of as the Copenhagen to Paris transition moment. The fact that sometimes you need a good failure, you have to walk away from a bad deal or the inability to get a deal in order to come back to it later. And one of the things that gives me comfort with respect to that is just to be reminded that the plastics crisis itself is not going away. It will just keep coming back. I would bet money that the plastics crisis 5 years from today or 10 years from today will be worse, according to all scientific indicators, than it is today, which means that the global pressure to seek a solution to this is not going away. And that is also something that is useful to remember. The third idea is something in between. And we've heard some talk about this. Two of my colleagues, Dan Budansky and Maria Ivanova, recently wrote a piece talking about the virtues of the MARPOL Treaty on Maritime Pollution as a kind of a menu-like treaty where all parties could sign up to a main part of the treaty, and then a series of protocols dealing with particular issues, sub-issues, articles could then be sort of available to, and you could bring the measure of ambition that you wish to this treaty, and it would allow us to find a passage through this moment. All three of these issues, it seems to me, it's too early to talk about. And in a way, what is needed in the interim from now until INC 5.2 is really to focus instead on continuing to build the treaty that was being built at Busan. In that sense, again, you heard the previous speakers refer to it, developing the proposals, bridging the proposals, building the coalitions, getting more systematic with the work that lines up behind these key issues. I think we need to understand better the so-called Rwanda coalition from the closing ceremony, the Mexico coalition, also from the closing ceremony, where the HAC stands on some of these things. The African group proposal, what was called the African group proposal on financing, same thing. All these things were positive, but in a way, that work needs to absolutely continue between now and 5.2. The second thing is by reminding ourselves about sort of where the effectiveness of the treaty lies, and not to take our eye off the ball. A colleague, Ian Johnston of mine, and I have written a little bit about this idea that you could think about treaty effectiveness or treaty strength along two axes, the sort of substantive axis of the provisions themselves, but then a procedural axis as well. It's equivalent to the idea of giving the treaty good bones. And there are sort of five things that one can look for. Other people may come to different lists of them. The first is national reports. All of these in some measure are in the chair's draft, which is encouraging, that some of them are not in it sufficiently, shall we say, in that respect. So regular national reports, currently Articles 14 and 15, an expert scientific function, ideally a committee itself. This is sort of the weaker of the elements. It's mentioned in 20 bis, but simply as, which is sort of about subsidiary bodies. All it says right now is the COP can create such bodies. I think we would like to see, I think it would be important to see specific designation of a scientific subcommittee, scientific body in the treaty language itself. Third is the Implementation Committee, which is currently in Article 13, which is great and essential. It could probably use a little bit of strengthening as well as we go. Fourth is regular review of the treaty by its parties, and this is the function of the Conference of Parties, Article 16 currently. There, the question about the voting process and the rules of procedure of the Conference of Parties arises. It's been discussed before, but this is an issue that does not go away. Our friends at the Center on International Environmental Law have produced a lot of good work on this issue, but detailing that in the treaty language itself would be essential. And fifth and finally, a defined process to amend, to upgrade, to evolve the substantive obligations, including the possibilities of new annexes. This might be the one that would depend the most on an answer to the three questions that we were talking about earlier. Exactly how do we see this treaty evolving from the day of signature onward? I think I would add a sixth, which is strengthening the language of the treaty with respect to human rights. And I think in specific terms, there is no reference in the treaty anywhere to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which, as you know, is a sort of the youngest of the human rights recognized by the Human Rights Council and by the General Assembly a couple of years ago. And it would be entirely fitting, entirely appropriate, and in fact, very important that it be understood that the work on plastics falls within the context of this human rights framework. The second thing that I would add is I think we could use this period, from my perspective, to improve the possibility and the outcome of the negotiations themselves. There is some work that can be done now. You heard Magnus speak to some of it. But I would, in particular, I think that there is more work to be done in terms of modeling and statistical understanding of some of the trade-offs and impact of what is being considered under Articles 3, 6, 3 on plastic products and chemicals of concern, 5 plastic product design, 6 supply, and 11 financial mechanism. We need modeling, we need data to inform some of the choices. I'm not aware of any substantial work in this area, but for the trade-offs and for the negotiations to be more productive, we need to have an understanding about the consequences of what is being written into the treaty or the impact of it over time. I don't see that yet. Similarly, I think we could use a better understanding of the underlying motivations of key states, key players. I think it's too easy if we want to promote an interest-based negotiation. We have to do a better job. I don't see a deep understanding between states of the interests or an awareness of the interests, long-term, medium-term, short-term of other states. So I believe there's a range of key players. I would include in that the United States, China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, probably a number of others, where a deeper understanding, greater dialogue with respect to what their interests are, what their concerns are, needs to be fostered in order to have a more productive next round. Similarly, mapping influence networks is always very interesting, figuring out how these coalitions and these member states work together. And then I think we've all mentioned it, but assessing and promoting the work of the various coalitions as bundlers of the interests that they represent. So the Mexico group, the Rwanda group, the HAC, the like-minded as well, insofar as these can all advance stated, clear, increasingly clear agendas and interests, they then begin to allow for a deepened discussion, a deepened negotiation. So I think those would be the elements that I could think of useful ways to spend the months between now and INC 5.2 or INC 6 conceptually, as I think I'm promoting the idea. And in that respect, I think also we need that time in order for some of the uncertainty that is that has emerged since the conclusion at Busan to dispel. Some of these questions will really not be resolved, not become apparent until the opening bell of 5.2 of round INC number 6. So we need to, in a way, prepare along different tracks. It is a moment of sobriety, of sober reflection, of preparation. I think the effort has to go to building the strong treaty that we had anticipated, the work that began in Busan in a way, with while maintaining the agility and the ability to adapt and to figure out what the best options may be as the negotiations themselves resume and move towards their conclusion at the end of that particular round. So With that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Elena Sima, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for passing the baton, and thank you as well for mentioning the MARPOL Convention and the fact that we can learn so much from existing treaties, existing MEAs, and we can, there's not really much that we need to reinvent, but there are so many lessons that we can draw. And I will try to make some references to some of other existing processes, existing treaties that can teach us a lot, in particular about financing. So we'll focus in these few minutes that I have. I will talk a little bit about the financing, let's say, component of the process, of the negotiations, and of the treaty. And I want to start by just underlining the importance of this dimension and this component of the treaty. This is something that is, first of all, required by international environmental law, the idea of providing support to less developed countries, and to keep in mind the differences among countries when designing a financial mechanism or a financial system for support. It is really rooted in the idea that a treaty like this, like any other environmental treaty, should aim at preventing environmental harm. So the overarching idea is to just facilitate compliance, and providing technical and financial support is precisely how we make sure that all countries can contribute at different levels, but all countries are put in a situation where they can, in a way or another, contribute. Then at a practical level, I believe that this part of the treaty is one of the most complicated, it's one of the most fascinating, but it's also one of the most critical to a success of the negotiations. I believe it is key in order to ensure the participation of countries. Less developed countries would not participate if financial support and a good and efficient financial mechanism is not in place. At the same time, it is also a part of the treaty that raises some concerns for developed countries, or for those countries that are those that should provide the financial support. They have a significant interest in the actual formulation and the actual design. But I do think that, again, any environmental treaty will be very hard to negotiate without a clear idea of this component. And that is why I do believe that is really key, and this is one of the aspects that it's really important to discuss, and we need to try to make some progress and some steps forward. Now, the good news, I think, after all this process is that, at least from the way I see it, there is a general agreement as to the importance of coming up with a good section, with a good provision on financing. And we have now a draft article, Article 11. Now, the bad news is that there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And I think that there are still a lot of challenges, still many areas where there is quite significant disagreement among countries, and some are interconnected. Now, I could go on for a very long time, so I've decided to just focus on what I believe are five main challenges and open and unanswered questions. But then, of course, I'm happy to also touch upon others. And these are all, again, questions that have not yet been answered by the draft that we have. So the first point is the type of the obligation, of the financing or funding obligation. Now, very different formulations have been proposed. There are different types of language and different levels and types of commitments. From a legal standpoint, different terms are used: shall, undertakes, the idea of voluntary contribution. So this is a first question that has to be addressed. And it doesn't have to be addressed on its own. We can also link it with my second main point, which is first of all, who are the subjects of these obligations? So what countries have to provide the financing, the funding, and to whom? So which countries should be the recipients? Now, here again, there is a certain level of disagreement. And here is, I believe, where, for example, when we're thinking about what countries should provide the funding, that's where the first point, so what kind of obligation can also can also help in the discussion, because we could even think about different levels of obligations for different countries. I'm thinking, for example, of the multilateral fund of the Montreal Protocol, which is financed by mandatory contributions from developed countries and then contributions from other parties that are just encouraged and are on a voluntary basis. So the discussion on the question of mandatory, voluntary could also then be brought in a discussion on which countries, which parties should provide the funding. Another, like a third point, and probably I think the biggest question is really in terms of the source of the financing. This is a big question, and the text right now envisions multiple possible funding streams, public financing, domestically, private, different mechanisms, plastic fees, extended producer responsibility, multilateral aid, private sector investment, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of options out there. Now there are a couple of things that I kind of would like to highlight. The first one is that these don't have to be alternative. Of course, we can also think of a system where there are several different mechanisms in place, and where we can, for example, mix private and public. Of course, so the first, I think, element to keep in mind is that we could envision mechanisms where there are multiple sources. And again, there are several examples under the Kyoto Protocol. For example, there was the prototype carbon fund. There was hybrid. It was mixed private and public, or the private sector facility of the Green Climate Fund. The climate regime is actually an excellent example when it comes to different types of financing mechanisms. And this takes me to the second point, that yes, that we can envision a mix of different sources, and that we can learn so much from other treaties. So I do think that existing agreements and existing funds can really provide a lot of different types of mechanisms that we can look at. Now, a fourth point that I wanted to make is about the kind of fund. So if we think about a new independent multilateral fund, rather than relying on an existing mechanism such as the Global Environmental Facility, then again, there are a lot of things that we could think about. And just like for the approaches and for the sources of the financing, it doesn't have to just be one fund. There are some parties, for example, that have been advocating for a remediation fund alongside a more a dedicated financial mechanism. And honestly, the two can coexist. Again, the climate regime is a very good example. There are multiple funds in the climate regime. We had, for example, funds for mitigation and adaptation, funds for loss and damage. So that's also something to keep in mind. And finally, the last point that I think is something that is, again, there is agreement in general terms, but then there are a lot of elements that have to be really straightened out, is how to prioritize certain especially vulnerable states. I'm thinking of small island developing states, for example, or least developed countries. That of course should be prioritized in terms of being recipients of this financing. And again, I think that here it's important to really select and identify the factors that should be taken into account when identifying these specific categories. And here again, we have in some MEAs some good examples of how to differentiate and how to identify these more vulnerable countries. Now, I just wanted to focus on these 5, I believe, challenges or unanswered questions. But there are, of course, a lot of other elements of Article 11 and of the whole financing section of the text that are still open for discussion. So I'm also happy to continue in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, we were hoping you would be taking the questions. And I let Talash and Magnus maybe react first. And when you want to drop a question, just let us know and we move to the next slide.
Sorry about that. So is there a path to having rules of procedure that would allow for voting? I mean, this is very controversial. This very question held up most of Inc. 2. And it's just unclear. The current rules of procedure, it's not very clear. That I'm just gonna stop there. I feel like it's very controversial, and there are very many people on the call, and yeah.
Maybe I can step in and maybe also reflect a bit on this question, agreeing very much that it's a controversial question that has been discussed at length in the INC and took up more than half of the negotiation time at the meeting INC2 in Paris, and has come up repeatedly. Maybe just very briefly, I would say, if there's to the question, is there a path to having rules of procedure that would allow voting? If the question is there a procedural path, the answer is yes, I would say. There is a procedural path for the adoption of the rules of procedure. To get a little bit technical, as I think Talash notes in the answer in the chat, is that this is related to Rule 38.1 in the rules of procedure regarding decision making on substantive matters, and that's what's been very controversial. That includes like big decisions such as treaty adoption, for instance, and that has a long history, but it's in dispute. I think we can all agree that rule. But there is another rule in the rules procedure 38.2, which relates to procedural questions, and procedural questions can be settled by a vote of simple majority, and that rule has not been contested. And insofar as the rules procedure provisionally apply to the work of the INC, which was a decision made at INC 1, it is possible to settle, in theory, there's possible to settle the question of the rules procedure through Rule 38.2, the procedural, and sort of frame that as procedural question. Now, there's all kinds of scenarios that comes up when thinking about these things, because it can be disputed whether the adoption of the rules procedure is a procedural question or a substantive question. But there's also a mechanism in then, if you look at Rule 38.3, for settling those kinds of issues. So I think that in general, the rules procedure as they are currently drafted and as they apply to the committee, they do allow for a resolution to this issue. But I think the bigger question, if you interpret your question, the question on the screen as, is there a political path to having the rules of procedure adopted? That's a very different question, and it's much harder to answer. But I would say, where there's a will, there's a way, always, and that applies to these negotiations as well.
This is a very interesting question. I mean, maybe it might be that we need to change where we need to talk about the scope. And if we look at what the scope could be for this treaty, if the scope is on plastic, and like if we imagine that plastic pollution starts at the level of production of plastic, then perhaps it's possible. Perhaps it's possible for, if we're going to be true to the mandate of Resolution 514, then the countries that are the producers of plastic really do have to step up, very much like under the UNFCCC. But we're also very cognizant of how that's going. Thank you for this question. It's very difficult.
Can I just maybe jump in and add a thought, which is I often think about this. I said, if I want to sell you a kilo of something, my ability to sell it to you depends on your willingness to buy it. And so, and this is part of the reason why I think it's a moment of sober reflection on all parts. I think there's a danger for people to overread their hand as well. The problem will not go away if they, and so you have a question. The real question becomes where this issue, this specific issue, finds resolution? Does it find resolution at the international regulation level, i.e. in a treaty, or does it find resolution within regional markets, which is regional markets will begin to establish their own regulatory frameworks about importing plastic, sale of plastic, resale of plastic? Does it fall at the national level? And so this question, a production on a cap production, or the question of supply, will eventually find an answer. The question is where it finds an answer and at the end of what process. There's been a proposal that it find an answer here in the international treaty. There are reasons to believe that this would be an excellent place, an excellent way for it to do so. But if that doesn't happen, then it will probably find a stable point in other ways through other mechanisms. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think really absolutely everyone needs to think, do we need a treaty now? And what are the costs of not securing a treaty now, or of not having the treaty address certain issues now? The issues themselves will not go away. And so the risk that you run if you give up, if you successfully exclude this issue from the treaty, is that this issue will go and find a resolution outside the treaty framework somewhere else, where you may have much less control over it.
Nobody knows. I don't know. Does anyone know?
No, but the last minutes of the Bureau meeting was that they were exploring maybe July, maybe in Geneva, but unclear. We are yet to hear the official communication.
I heard Geneva as well.
Maybe I could take a first attempt at this, and I would welcome any of the panelists come to my help on this one. I think you heard me articulate earlier. I believe the position of the U.S. and its engagement with this is not yet known. I think we have to be sober and careful in the way in which we describe this, and not surrender to hyperbole on either side. We don't know yet. The U.S. has withdrawn from 2 out of 3 international negotiation processes that it was formally engaged in: the pandemic treaty and the taxation treaty. It did so following executive orders signed from the White House, and then it exited those processes in one case 3 days before the 13th round of the pandemic treaty, and in another case on the opening afternoon of the first day of the taxation treaty. As I said, in both cases, it followed executive orders issued out of the White House very early on. We have not had such an executive order in the case of plastics. And I think, therefore, we shouldn't interpret it one way or the other. There has been the paper straws executive order, which gives an indication that all is not well with respect to the focus on plastics. That executive order, for those of you who are not familiar, basically tried to remove the use and the purchase by the federal government of paper straws as a replacement for plastic straws. But again, I think it's useful not to move precipitously with respect to this, and therefore to continue with the business, with the work that we've all outlined here about enriching and building the negotiations and taking them to the next level, without which they cannot succeed one way or the other. I think we will obviously find out whether it's on a couple of days before, or a week before, or the day of, or so on. We will have an answer to this question, and at that point, then some of these other issues will come back around with respect to they've come out in the chat already and in the Q&A already, with respect to a treaty of the willing, with respect to how quote unquote weak a treaty is acceptable, whether no treaty would be a better option. All these things, it seems to me, are really things that cannot be answered now, and in some ways are distractions, if I can suggest that, for the work that we've outlined here of building a really rich, profound, serious, sober next round of negotiations on this treaty. Thank you.
I think, just quickly, sorry if you don't mind, every treaty negotiation gives delegates an opportunity to innovate, right? So for Montreal Protocol, we have the multilateral fund. For the Mercury Treaty, we have the Special International Program, which is the funding mechanisms, which are different from others. So maybe this is an opportunity, right? Like at the end of Busan, we didn't know that the global financial landscape was going to change as it has, and maybe this pushes us into a new space where we can get some real innovation where financing is concerned. And maybe Elena wants to say more on this.
No, for sure. I'm going to say something that maybe is going to be a little bit controversial. So I'm happy to also spark a debate with the other panelists. But kind of taking this question and the one before about, what if we don't reach a consensus? I do think that this global binding treaty on plastic is an extremely ambitious effort, way more ambitious than, at least to my knowledge, any other previous multilateral environmental agreement. Not only the problem that it tackles is extremely complex, but there has been this intention, because of the urgency of the situation as well, to go straight to just a binding treaty with all the elements that we can find in the treaty, covering the whole supply chain and so on, the production cycle and so on and so forth. And again, I'm going to say something a little controversial, but I do think that there are, most treaties have generally, they usually start with the framework convention and then we go to protocols. And of course, we are a little bit too far ahead to go back to a framework convention. But the idea of maybe, dividing certain aspects or certain topics, I'm thinking of an example that maybe we will see how successful it's going to be, but the fishery subsidies agreement at the WTO, where they split two huge issues in a first wave and a second wave. It kind of worked at the time to try and find consensus on some of the issues, and then move to others, or the way in which the many protocols to some conventions work, like long-range transboundary air pollution, where you have your convention and then several protocols that touch upon specific aspects. And again, I know that it goes a little bit in a different direction than what the negotiations have been so far. And I'm not saying that this is a best route, but I do think that if at a certain point there are certain aspects that really are blocking the whole negotiations, it could be maybe, unless they are essential. I think financing is essential. We can't leave this for later. But it could, it could be something to think about if there are some elements that could be kind of set for a second wave or a second phase.
If I may also jump in on this. Oh, sorry. But yeah, just very quickly on this as well, since I think those thoughts about a framework convention are very interesting, and I very much like controversial suggestions, Elena, so appreciate that. I think also for me, that question highlights really the problem of consensus, right? I mean, consensus will make a treaty-making process extremely sensitive to the point of allergic to particular developments or political developments in particular countries, right? And that's one of the big problems with consensus. And I think, thinking about this treaty as a strategy, we need this strategy and this treaty to be effective, even if some countries don't initially join, right? To develop those rules and develop those mechanisms that will help reduce and end plastic pollution, and then sort of set a standard that allows other countries that may not initially join to join later on in time. And I think there's also clear precedence for that, right? I mean, many treaties, they have been developed by a smaller group of states and then gradually gone through a process of universalization, where when the political developments in a particular country, the stars align in a sense, then they can join this treaty. And I think that's also one way to think about this question.
Can I jump back in, and I know there are other questions, but in a way, this is the sort of such an interesting thing. I think the points that you just been made are all essential. And then I think this is a little bit why I was saying, look, I think there's more work to be done with respect to exploring the fundamental interests of states in order to promote, I would say, another layer of depth of interest-based negotiation. We've kind of spent a couple INCs with everybody talking over each other's head, and where I think most parties think they understand the interest of other parties, but it's not always clear that that's the case. And the life cycle of this negotiation from 2022, from the UNEA resolution until present, has covered an extraordinarily chaotic and dynamic period in the international system. It's a little bit like negotiating on the back of a tiger. So much has changed, keeps changing between every INC. We have had fundamental changes, and as much as we like to inspire ourselves from the previous examples, the good work, the framework conventions, whether it's Montreal or Marpol or draw on all these things, I think you heard it here, and I think the point is very well made. There is going to be a need to innovate here and now, to do something, to bring together elements that haven't necessarily been brought together in the same way before. That burden falls on the negotiators and on the ones that are going to have to try and bridge the views and the positions between major coalitions and groups. It can't be done deep inside. It has to be done at the edges. It has to be done in discussion between the like-minded and the hack. It has to be done between the so-called Mexico group, the so-called Rwanda group, and a variety of others that are going to come along with this. And only at the end of that, I think, will we know whether there's a treaty there in some respects. But that process itself is going to be extremely interesting and rich to watch, and difficult. So I in a way, wishing you all the best of luck. I can take a start, but I'm sure some of my fellow panelists have other things to add. Having been in Busan and in the previous rounds, I shared the frustration of many of the NGOs and observers in the process. I think we had significant challenges, some of them technical. I've heard Ambassador Vaya since then speak to the need to improve communication and participation for observers, participants. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Secretariat, on behalf of the chair here, but I have heard those statements made, while at the same time, I've also heard them defending the need for member states to have their own space and their own margin of operation within which to move this process, which they underline is a member state led and driven process in that sense. I think that there are, again, here some creative things that could be done to increase that sense of participation and engagement. I heard the SIDS representatives and yesterday making reference to the fact, saying that the intercessional period is when NGOs and observers can best affect and impact the process by engaging the member states during that period. I thought the point was very well taken. It's easy to think that this comes down to the negotiation sessions themselves, and that's when one wants to be heard by member states, but the reality is it's probably the months beforehand. So again, we come back to how best to use the time now, and I think that is probably a really important aspect of this.
Maybe I can also jump in on this question very, very quickly, just to maybe build upon that point made by Josh, that I think inclusivity and participation in discussions is partly a question of whether meetings are accessible, open, or closed, right? And you sort of NGOs, observers, others are able to actually follow and find out what is going on, and maybe also meaningfully interact, right, and provide their opinions and provide their points on the different items under discussion. But I think maybe equally important it is the extent to which countries that are involved in these negotiations are open to NGO input on a sort of ongoing basis. And in my experience, many of the delegates, many of the countries, not all, but many of them are very open to hearing from NGOs if they are approached, and they want to hear their points, and they also take these points on board when they formulate their positions. And in many ways that work, and again, building upon what Josh said, that work that is done in the run-up to the negotiation sessions is also, in my experience from other treaty-making processes, more important, in a sense, more essential than the work that is actually taking place in the negotiation sessions themselves. I don't want to take too much space, but I find all these questions really good. Does anyone else want to comment on this one?
Well, I mean, I guess there is a section for amending the treaty and making sure that, I mean, the states can amend the treaty. This is a growing issue, as we know, right? The science is still growing. We're still learning so much about this, and just creating a treaty that is flexible enough to take in all of the knowledge that is going to come through in the next 15 years is very, very important. And I think that section on amendment, which hopefully is easier to agree because it's part of the final provisions and it's sort of agreed language in other provisions, maybe that helps.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is partly a question of treaty amendments, and particularly if you go down the route of towards a framework convention solution, as you suggested, Elena. I think the question about treaty amendments and developing of the rules in the future and how to do that, it becomes increasingly important, right? And is there a credible decision-making mechanism to ensure the strengthening the adoption of new annexes and new protocols down the line, right? Incredibly important. I think, in these negotiations, and I think we saw that increasingly in Busan, there's also a question of the decision-making rule of the Conference of Parties, which is a slightly different issue, but that's also been contested to some extent, whether the Conference of Parties will adopt their rules of procedure by consensus or by some other mechanism. And I think, given, I think we all, if a treaty can be concluded this year, as I think the Norwegian ambassador indicated was the ambition, right? There is a lot of questions and a lot of work that the Conference of Parties will be required to do. Now, we know from other MEAs that adopting the rules procedure of Conference of Parties has been a very, very difficult issue. For instance, in UNFCCC, I don't think they've been working on this since 1996 and still have some of the rules procedure in brackets, right? Particularly the decision-making rule, which has had an impact on the work within that treaty, right? So I think, given the high number of decisions that will have to be made and important decisions that will have to be made by the Conference of Parties, it's essential that Conference of Parties has a clear decision-making rule, and I would argue that decision-making rule should allow for again voting as a last resort if efforts at achieving consensus have been exhausted.
To pick up on Talash's very important point and yours, Magnus, I think the takeaway from this, as I think I mentioned earlier, is that with respect to the chair's draft, the chair's text, two aspects that need, in a way, to be resolved in the text itself and not kicked downfield to the COP. I would argue the first is sort of to name a scientific body, because I think this is a really, really important. We need to embed. It may be difficult to negotiate now, but it will be enormously helpful down the road in the future to embed scientific review inside the treaty explicitly as a fundamental part. It will help all of us to be able to refer back to expertise and to technical expertise, scientific expertise with respect to the range of issues. As Talash pointed out, the science is barely, I mean, the front edge of the science on plastics is moving so fast in some ways. The treaty structure has to accommodate for that. And the second thing is the decision-making of the COP itself. It is possible to hobble the COP by, as an example just given by Magnus, if we don't, basically if the draft treaty text itself does not help resolve this problem before it creates the next problem in that sense. So for me, those are the sort of the two takeaways on this issue in particular.
I really don't want to go first because, as my organization, as you know, we have a very privileged position as observers for most of the multilateral environmental agreements. So I'm gonna hand this over to everybody else.
I'll take a first stab at it on the promise that somebody will come and rescue me. But I think you heard Marcus just make one reference, for example, to and I think it's not too hard to look and find difficult experience in almost every treaty process, and there's probably and to me this just makes the point, which is every treaty process is sui generis. It arises in response to a subject, it arises at a particular time, and it arises in a process characterized by a number of players. And so we can draw on the positive and the negative examples from other treaties and other times and other spaces dealing with other issues. But in the end, they are no guide with respect to what has to be done on plastics here today by the member states present at the table today in 2025. And I think that hence the burden of innovation and adaptation and agility and creativity, even as you draw on the vast body of learning that is the past in these various MEAs and outside the MEA process as well. And I think so. You know, we could take it. We could take a topic. We could raise Montreal, or we could raise any number of the Mercury process or whatever it was, and we would each one of us have a view on what worked and what didn't work, or what's a problem, what isn't a problem. But in the end, it would not guide us with respect to perhaps the elements that we have to put in place here and now on this particular agenda.
If I may build upon that, and very much agree with you, Josh. I mean, maybe 2 points that we've seen from previous treaty negotiations and that tend to happen is when in negotiations too much ambiguity is introduced into the provisions, leaving a lot of room for interpretation as to what the states parties are actually required to do. Sometimes it comes to a point where that ambiguity gives rise to significant uncertainty, and just having these political battles having to be run over and over again throughout the implementation process of the treaty, and basically not providing the guidance the states parties need to implement their provisions, right? And I think there are several examples of that, both within and outside the MEA space. I just know that just because there's been a meeting this week in Geneva on the Arms Trade Treaty, and I know that that's a treaty that has significant ambiguity introduced into its provisions, and therefore I think it's very clear lacking effectiveness because the provisions are interpreted in so many different ways, and it makes it harder to actually monitor treaty compliance and treaty implementation, because it's initially very unclear what states parties are actually required to do, right? And this is, of course, related to the question of why is ambiguity introduced. And again, that comes back to the question of decision-making and the strive for consensus. If the top priority is always to get everybody to agree, then you will have to allow significant ambiguity in treaty provisions. But if you allow for more clarity in the language, then you will have to look at other treaty adoption modalities, I think.
If I can just very, very quickly build on both Joshua and Magnus's. So I, first of all, agree with Joshua on, that we can just take whatever happened in the past and just apply it, whether it's problems or challenges, or whether it's positive elements that we had in previous MEAs. And I always like to refer to what's already been done, because I do think that we have a lot of interesting lessons, and there's a lot of interesting ways of solving certain challenges that we can find in other treaties. But I do agree that every negotiation is a different process. Every topic is a completely different. It's also a different time geopolitically than when other MEAs were negotiated. And so, of course, whenever we're looking at shortcomings of previous processes or positive aspects, it's true that we always need to keep in mind, again, that we can't just take them and then just apply. Something that might have not worked in a treaty might actually be very helpful here. So I think that it's important, first of all, to take this into account. And then in terms of this element on the constructive ambiguity or ambiguity that Magnus, you were referring to, I think it also opens up another question that I think you were maybe hinting at, which is this idea that, should we have this maybe more ambiguous language so that more parties can join, or should we have something which is clearer, which is a little bit more rigid in the formulation, with the risk that less parties the less countries will join, which is, I think, another, I don't know if a question is going to come up on this, but I think that that's also something that we experienced in many negotiations. I'm thinking of climate. I mean, the whole shift from UNFCCC Kyoto to Paris is a good example of this, of should we have everybody in to address this global challenge? But then, of course, with all the compromises, watered down language and so on, or should we just have, you know, some champions with a clearer treaty? I think that this is an extremely difficult question, but it is something that might, you know, that we might have to tackle at some point.
The thing I can add is, you know, have a time frame. So it was good to hear the ambassador saying by the end of the year, the BBNJ negotiations went on for almost 19 years. You know, maybe the states shouldn't do that.
Very, very quickly, yes, and that there's also something else. I'm glad you brought up the BBNJ. There's also another point, because we don't just have to think of a language and a text that countries would sign, but also one that the countries would ratify. Because the BBNJ is an excellent example. It took forever to negotiate. We have finally this text, but we're still very far away from the number of ratifications that we need. So that's also important to think about that step, because a text that isn't ratified sends a beautiful message, but doesn't really do much concretely. So that's also another element that we always need to keep in mind.
Can I add a thought into this? Because again, here we are, we're going off into a really interesting conversation about this. You know, I mentioned earlier the example of the MARPOL Convention, which is maritime pollution by ships, and it's cited in an article a couple of weeks ago by Maria Ivanova and Dan Bodansky, and it strikes me as a sort of a really interesting model for what I would call this particular phase of reflection 5.1 to 5.2, and it basically, I'm simplifying it, but the way in which it would apply to the plastics treaty concept is you would create a core element in which you would put all the sort of things that people are going to argue the least about: principles, mode of implementation, a whole series of the sort of the fundamentals of the treaty, but the ones that are not controversial. And then you would set up a set of protocols that, you know, you could think about a protocol on Article 3 on products and on chemicals of concern, and perhaps another one on 5, and another one on 6, and so on and so forth. I hear these discussions about past agreements, and then I think to myself, what was the world like at that point in time? What was the broad multilateral gestalt, the feeling, the limitations on the system at that time as opposed to today? And this is where the sort of the international relations observer in me kicks in and starts saying, what can we manage today? What is doable today? And that may sometimes be a different answer from what was doable 5 or 10 years ago, or what may be doable 5 years from today, but we can only address ourselves to what's doable today. I'm not suggesting reduction in ambition. That's why I want to be very clear. You got to keep negotiating hard for the highest, best, purest, strongest treaty that we can get. But I do think that we have to temper that with a sensitivity and understanding about the moment that we're in and what is achievable and doable. You know, a weak treaty, a so-called weak or partial treaty is worse than no treaty at all. I think that's a very difficult judgment to make in this moment in time. And I think we would have to see really, you know, on the last day of 5.2, where are we in that respect, having tried very hard up until then to come to terms to the best treaty that we can. Let me take a first stab, and then maybe one of you can jump in. Look, this could be an important part of national plans. You could invite countries to speak to limitations on plastic subsidies in their plans. I think the question here implies, could you put it into the regulatory framework as opposed to just leaving it in the reporting framework? Could you compel? Could you require? I think I would find that very difficult, having listened to some of the states and their positions at INC 5.1 in Busan. many states would consider plastic subsidies to be a fundamentally domestic, sovereign, fiscal matter that they would not accept to be regulated at the international level, and would insist must be managed at the national level. That said, you might be able to put in aspirations, reporting requirements, or common goals into a treaty that would address this issue nonetheless.
I agree. And I also think that, considering the need for ensuring mutual supportiveness between environmental treaties and treaties in other areas of international law, I'm thinking of trade treaties in particular, and WTO agreement where there is a specific text dealing with subsidies and regulating subsidies, then another question is, should we add something like this in that treaty? But I think it would be just hard to have something that would still allow for the mutual supportiveness between the treaties, because it couldn't just derogate the kind of obligations that countries have accepted under other treaties. In particular, I'm thinking of the WTO subsidies and countervailing measures treaty. So what Joshua was mentioning, objective aspiration, something with more of a hortatory language rather than mandatory, is something that I could think of.
Dear colleagues, there are many more questions, but we are arriving at the end, very close to the end of the time of this event. So it's now time to give the floor to Michel Chiron from Switzerland for his concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Diana, for giving me the floor. Dear colleagues, distinguished panelists and participants, first of all, I would like to thank the Geneva Environment Network for organizing today's event. And thank you all for participating in this insightful discussion as part of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue series. Today, our panelists have provided valuable insights into the current state of the negotiations and the challenges we face. It is clear that maintaining momentum and ambition is essential as we approach the INC 5.2. And I would like to briefly highlight some of the important points that I have heard today with regards to the Plastic Treaty State of Play and the priorities for an ambitious outcome from the panelists and through also the questions from the participants. I have sort of grouped into 3 main points. The 3 points are measurable and binding targets, not business as usual. The second is addressing issues even if difficult. And the third is functioning solutions. So, measurable and binding targets, not business as usual. Ambassador Anderson mentioned at the outset that the figures of the plastics ending up in rivers and lakes and the oceans without adequate changes and measures. So this clearly describes what needs to be addressed, and that business as usual is not an option. We, on the contrary, need clear and measurable targets for reducing plastic pollution throughout the life cycle of plastics. That is also foreseen in the UNA Resolution 5/14, agreed already before we started the INC, the resolution which was referenced by Taras Kantai. This is essential to drive meaningful change. And this includes also global targets for sustainable production. We need a commitment to reach sustainable levels over time. A reference was made today to the Rwanda Group, and a statement in Busan where close to 100 countries stated production needs to be covered by the treaty. So again, on this first point, that we need binding, measurable targets, and it covers the whole full life cycle. Then the second important point going forward is addressing issues even if difficult. Elena Sima and Joshua Lincoln mentioned that it is helpful to look to the other MEAs as examples, and Taras Kantai explicitly mentioned the BRS regarding products and chemicals. Indeed, products and chemicals of concern are an area that is not the easiest to solve in the negotiation, but it is true, as Magnus Löwbold mentioned, that the Mexican statement showed on products and chemicals is a phase out is needed according to close to 100 countries that supported Mexican statement. So it shows that even if not an easy topic, there's no way around it. Legally binding measures to eliminate chemicals of concern in plastic products are seen key to an effective treaty. And it's true, in terms of the models that were mentioned, if looking to the BRS, then defining specific exemptions and setting phase-out dates, making reservations at time of ratification. These are elements that we can certainly look to models to have a global approach with rules that in principle apply to all, but then still take into account the national circumstances of the countries. I come to the third cluster of elements that I've heard today, functioning solutions. So at INC 5, several member states worked hard to find functioning solutions. This work must continue, we've heard today. There are Ambassador Vallas highlighted, our chair, the involvement in Busan, and that there is progress on the majority of provisions, and that this work needs to continue, especially ahead of INC 5.2. In fact, speakers after him also mentioned the importance of the chair's text in Busan to capture the involvement and the work that was done informally also, and many referenced that important step. Magnus Löwbold is also mentioning the question on how we agree on the text. So functioning solution is also to be seen in that regard. And who will be part of the agreement? It was said clearly today that more than 100 countries want an agreement that address the problem that we face. And so it's important to check on the options with those countries and continue the informal work. Solution options were also mentioned in terms of financing and implementation of the treaty as outlined by Elena Sima, where she spoke of different sources that should be used, and also to possibly use, for example, the extended producer responsibility to finance measures. Joshua Lincoln continued to stress we need to build the treaty. So this informal work now ahead of the negotiation is important, in particular with the countries and stakeholders that want to address the issue. He also mentioned the point, and then also let's think about how the treaty will evolve in the future. That means we need to sometimes pause and think about what really needs to be in the final treaty text to be able to end plastic pollution, and what can follow if the right mechanism is included in that treaty text. And then even is a question, some of the elements that we have discussed in the INC, perhaps they are less of a priority and they can be dealt with elsewhere in another instrument. So these are the three clusters of important messages that I have heard on where we stand and where we can best prepare for the INC 5.2. Let me just also certainly assure you that Switzerland remains very committed to finding also viable solutions, and that we will continue to work towards an effective plastics treaty and to collaborate and work hard with everyone involved. This certainly is an opportunity to achieve a transformative global treaty with a global approach that protects the environment and human health and fosters sustainable development. So thank you very much again for this session today. That was very fruitful. Merci. I wish you a good rest of the day, everyone. And back to you, Diana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel, and thank you to all the panelists who joined us today. Particular thanks to the chair, Ambassador Vallas. You have been with us through all the session, listening to all the comments and the questions that were raised throughout this session. We look forward to support you, Ambassador Vallas, and your team, and also the INC Secretariat, and all those who are engaged in this process, wherever the next session takes place in Geneva or not. And I take this opportunity to announce that one of the upcoming sessions in this series will be looking at observers' participation, and will take place on the 27th of March. I know, Ambassador Vallas, that you have received many letters addressing this topic, but you were very clear in your statement today about the efforts that you are making to have everybody on board for a good outcome. So with that, it's time to close and to thank you all, and looking forward to see you at the upcoming session.
Thank you, Diana. Bye-bye. Thank you to everybody.